Imagine you fell asleep and woke up in medieval England. 1350. That'd be pretty cool, right? Knights, castles, merry old England. I think we might be in for a shock. So I'm a potter from modern-day Stoke-on-Trent. How would I fare in medieval North Staffordshire? Am I going to find a teeming pottery industry, bustling towns, a hive of activity? This Time Travelling Stokie is about to find out. In modern times, Stoke-on-Trent is a city formed of 6 towns. Are we going to be able to visit those in this time? Sort of. The place names are going to sound familiar at least. Places like Chell, Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, even if the pronunciations are a bit funny. But we're not going to find any burgeoning towns. The Domesday Book tells us that these places are very sparsely populated at this time. Just small hamlets interspersed by farmland and streams. None of them are what you'd call a power centre. We'd need to go a bit further afield for that. Of course, we'd need to be on our guard for the journey. The medieval world was notoriously dangerous. Staffordshire was, statistically, one of the most dangerous and lawless counties in the country at this time. We could try heading to the nearest power centre, Newcastle-Under-Lyme, but even walking the few miles between Hanley and Newcastle will be a challenge. The roads aren't going to be great, and the people are not likely to be friendly. We'll stand out in our modern bright clothes, and they're going to look very colourful amongst the inhabitants of this time. Hopefully we can make it without running into too many people. As I mentioned, it's quite sparsely populated, and we've done this before when I came here in Anglo-Saxon times. Back then I just stuck to the roads, avoided the woods, and I was fine. There are new dangers now though, not just your standard bandits. At this time there were notorious gangs of outlaws, some were even rogue knights, and their business wasn't just petty theft, it was extortion. Think Robin Hood, but not so merry and bright. Kidnapping was a serious business, and we could be a prime target in our interesting clothing. We'd better go quick. After dark there's obviously no street lighting, and we're likely to end up in a ditch somewhere if we're not careful. So we could head to Newcastle-Under-Lyme, and, as the name suggests, we would find a castle there at this time. It isn't brand new, it was built just after the Norman conquest. I know where Newcastle is in modern times, and I've even passed through it in a few different points in history so far. Am I likely to recognise it? These days there's barely any evidence of a castle at all, apart from a few fragments of wall. But at this time it is actually an impressive castle surrounded by an artificial lake, so it's going to stand out. Are we likely to find any respite here? Well, amongst company, at least we're less likely to be ambushed, so there is that. Newcastle in the modern day is a busy market town, and it would certainly have been a hive of activity in this time too. Unfortunately though, the year is 1350. We're going to find a scene of utter devastation. Firstly, if you haven't been following this series so far, I'm an accidental time traveller who's been forced to live in a few different points of Staffordshire's history. So far I've been a Cornovi tribesman in the Iron Age, worked in Roman industry, and been a Mercian labourer on the Danelaw frontier. If you're enjoying this video, feel free to catch up on the previous episodes via the link in the description. So why is it a scene of utter devastation? Well, we've arrived at the tail end of one of the most horrific pandemics in human history. No, not COVID-19, I'm talking about the Black Death. An outbreak of plague that wiped out an estimated 50% of the population of Britain and mainland Europe. And Staffordshire did not escape its ravages. In fact, the climate of North Staffordshire meant it was hit quite hard, not just by the classic bubonic plague. The other killer in Staffordshire was pneumonic plague. This disease was airborne, and it thrived in Staffordshire's cool, damp climate. The prognosis for this was not good, and the symptoms were horrific. You could expect maybe 2 days of absolute agony from contracting the disease to dying, coughing up blood and struggling for breath the whole time. Could it be treated? Well, they tried. If you could afford them, physicians tried lancing the buboes with red-hot pokers. Often this just made things worse because they couldn't control the infections that followed. Folk medicines involved pressing live chickens against the sores to try and draw out the poison. Of course there was bloodletting. They genuinely believed that the body was producing too much blood, so they let some of it out. If we went to an actual hospital, we could expect to be prayed for maybe, though by this point they knew there wasn't much point. Nobody who contracted the plague really could be saved. What was worse was not that it couldn't be treated. but they didn't know how to prevent it either. Obviously they had no concept of epidemiology. They thought the plague was just God's wrath, and they understood it in this context. The predominant theory at the time was the miasma theory about how things spread. Things literally spread by bad air. Germ theory wouldn't be developed for centuries. So proximity to each other wasn't really understood as a cause. If the air was bad, you could simply catch it no matter how far apart you were. We've all seen the famous images of the plague doctors. The best thing we could do, knowing the cause, is to avoid people as much as possible, and avoid any dirty, crowded areas. Easier said than done at this time. Fleas, poor hygiene and pestilence were simply a fact of life. The Black Death in Staffordshire didn't just kill people. It shattered every system that held society together. Before the plague, there was a rigid feudal hierarchy. Lords owned the land, peasants worked the land. There were sheriffs and bailiffs enforcing the king's laws. Everything had order. But when half the population dies in 2 years, both noble and peasant alike, that order collapses. The labour shortage is catastrophic. Suddenly, the surviving peasants realise they're valuable, and for the first time in medieval history, workers have some leverage. They start refusing to do unpaid labour. They wander off to find other masters who can pay them more. The old rules that bound people to the land suddenly didn't work in practice anymore, because people felt they had not much to lose and were willing to take the risk. Naturally, the response to this was for the system to adapt. Cordial meetings were held to discuss the peasants' position and to come up with a compromise and a congenial way forward, based on cooperation. Nah, just kidding, the king cracked down on it hard. King Edward III tried to fix this with what he called the Ordinance of Labourers. He essentially froze all wages at pre-pandemic levels, and then made it a literal crime for anyone to demand higher pay or refuse to work. Picture life under Reform UK. But there's a small problem. He can't really enforce it. The courts are overwhelmed. The pandemic has caused a huge backlog of court cases, and there are far fewer magistrates around. To be clear, I'm talking about back in medieval times, not now. But I do get the confusion. We likely wouldn't have much luck trying to ask the local nobility for work. In this pandemic, lord and peasant alike suffered greatly. The major noble family in the area, the Audley family, lost several of their living relatives and many of their household staff, and they were in as much disarray as the rest of the local population. Lord Audley, whose lands included Tunstall and Burslem, lost his wife, his eldest son, and his stepmother in 1349. He's grief-stricken, and his entire administrative structure is in chaos. The Duchy of Lancaster holds Newcastle-Under-Lyme, but their lord is off being a diplomat and a military commander abroad. So the land's in turmoil, the peasants are revolting, and there's a danger of death at every turn. In other time periods, I just decided it was best to find out how I could settle into society, and my default was to go to my pottery skills. Every time period needs stuff to eat off and drink out of, but here I'd probably find very few customers. Everyone was mostly broke. No real demand for bowls when you've barely got anything to put in them. Life away from people is also going to be tricky and dangerous. I can't exactly live safely in the woods, living off the land. This is highly illegal at this time. I can't poach wild animals or even forage in certain parts due to the strict forest laws. If I'm caught, I'm in for it. And medieval justice is certainly something I don't want to face. Is there anywhere at all we could go to give us a fighting chance? Well, statistically more isolated woodland communities such as Colton fared better in the area than most. This wasn't just because they were isolated. They still had to go into bigger population centres for markets and things. But mainly because their economies were more diverse. It didn't make them more immune to the plague itself, but it certainly helped them to weather the storm economically. We could try joining one of these communities as a potter and ride out the pandemic that way. There is one more alternative. One place in the local area has survived the turmoil, and might be somewhere we could find some respite. The local Cistercian monastery, Hulton Abbey. Traditionally, Cistercian abbeys were largely funded by patronage and donations from nobility, hopefully in exchange for the salvation of their eternal soul. Most of this has gone up the Swanee now, though. Those nobles that provided the donations have considerably reduced in number. Many did leave donations of money and land to the abbey in their wills, but their ongoing patronage is now no longer guaranteed. In the plague years, the income of the abbey literally halved, but it didn't go under. Why? Because of a rather modern concept: diversification. Cistercians were also known as the White Monks from the colour of their habits, and the main driver of their economy, which was wool. Hulton Abbey too had its fair share of agricultural and pasture land, and sheep, but thanks to the effects of the Black Death, they have far fewer people to work that land. There aren't enough monks themselves to do it all, and the lay workers they relied on are far fewer in number than they were a few years ago. But there's something else that Hulton Abbey is blessed with: natural resources. The very things that would drive the future economy and growth of Stoke-on-Trent: clay, coal, iron. All of these were found on the abbey's lands. For a small monastery, it had a pretty diverse economy, which stood it in good stead. The monks even worked the coal seams and iron foundries themselves, along with their outside labourers. To get round this problem, they started leasing out the mining rights and the rights to these natural resources, mainly to the remaining wealthy locals, who could still afford to pay higher wages. It marks a shift from direct labour to contracting and outsourcing, long before the Industrial Revolution itself kicked off. As for pottery, the monks at Hulton Abbey had been producing pottery for years, but around 1350 they were also innovating. They were experimenting with higher temperature firing and more elaborate kilns. This would lead to a new kind of ware, called Midlands purpleware, which was harder and more durable, and it had everything on site that it needed to produce this ware: the clay and the fuel. The Black Death was crushing the existing economy, but was also shifting wealth towards institutions that could diversify, and we could probably do a lot worse than make use of our skills here. So say we managed to ride out the plague, it would be great to see more of the medieval world. But what is there to see? This time period's unusual so far because a lot of the sites I'm likely to see are still around in modern times. The monasteries, before Henry VIII got his hands on them. At this time many were alive and well, and in all of their splendour. Locally we have Croxton Abbey, and Much Wenlock Priory a bit further out. In the north there are Fountains and Revolt, which are some of the most splendid buildings ever built. In France there's Cluny and Saint-Denis. Of course there are many castles to see too. In Staffordshire there's Stafford Castle, and Chartley Castle as well nearby. But it'd be incredible to see the grand castles of Edward I in Wales, along with all the fortified towns. Then there are the cathedrals, towering on the horizon. There are also plenty of things we wouldn't want to see. Public executions and decaying bodies of criminals were going to be common sights. Not to mention people suffering from the horrors of leprosy, smallpox and cholera. On the whole, this isn't a nice place to be, and I hope we don't have to spend too much time here. Where would you go if you found yourself in medieval England? Do you think you could survive? If so, how would you go about it? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look at medieval Staffordshire, don't forget to check out the rest of the series and subscribe to the channel for more. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.